I hope you're ready for this. Everything you need to know about 1984 Part 2, Chapter 9. Now, if you haven't read this chapter, I'm going to front load you. This is the hardest chapter in the book. Not only is it long, it's also difficult and dense reading. And I'm going to be honest, it's horribly boring because a lot of it is just Winston reading the book out loud, and portions of the book are just written into the chapter. And it's basically political theory and explanations of how the party came to be and how the party works. So reading it is kind of like trying to walk through quicksand with cinder blocks as shoes. It's 32 pages long, and it's going to be the longest 32 pages of your life. So I'm going to try to boil it down to the basics, but there's a lot of basics. So let's go. So the chapter opens. Winston is totally wrecked from working so much during Hate Week, right? It says he worked more than 90 hours in 5 days. If you don't want to do the math, that's about 18 hours a day. So now that he's at the end of this work week, he has really not a lot left to do. So he's going to their hiding place for part of the afternoon and evening, and then he's going to go crash in his own bed after that. We find out he's had the book for 6 days, and he's been so busy he hasn't even looked at it, right? The basic reason is because everyone in the Ministry of Truth is working so hard because on the 6th day of Hate Week, all of a sudden they were at war with Eastasia, and Eurasia was an ally. Remember, this is the complete opposite of what it's been for years. And the way it happened is what's so unbelievable. So Winston was at this nighttime rally listening to this really angry and powerful speaker. The crowd was just going nuts, and they were carrying on and screaming. And just in the middle of the speech, the speaker gets a slip of paper, and he just keeps right on speaking. But from that point on, every name of the enemy and ally was switched, the opposite of what it was at the beginning of the speech. What the people noticed was not the change or the switch that everything they thought was wrong, but they just put it on that the banners and the propaganda was wrong. And obviously, they had been sabotaged. So everything was torn down within 3 minutes, and then everything carried on as normal with a new enemy that no one acknowledged. It was as though the new enemy was the old enemy and nothing had changed, right? So this is when Winston was given the briefcase, right? He had to go directly to work, and when the demonstration was over, because 5 years of news and literature had to be fixed now to reflect the new reality, which could never be identified as the wrong reality. So it was the records and accounts that were wrong, that were sabotaged, and the idea is that if Oceania was at war with Eastasia, it was always at war with Eastasia. They weren't ever at war with Eurasia. So everyone at the Ministry of Truth had to work around the clock to make every single piece of evidence and documentation align with the new truth. It took 6 days to do it. So now he was heading to Charrington's shop before Julia arrived to start reading the book. And what follows after that is 13 straight pages of a section of the book. The author of the book is listed as Emmanuel Goldstein, and the title is The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. An oligarchy is a small group having control, and collectivism is giving the larger group priority over every individual in it. So basically, it's the political structure of Oceania. So what I'm going to do is boil down the basic points into bullet points, kind of help understand what the book is saying. Winston starts briefly with chapter 1, which is called Ignorance is Strength, right? You should recognize that as one of the party slogans. This part is only half a page and basically communicates the idea that in any developed society around the world, there's a division in classes, right, of low, middle, and high. You might call those lower class, middle class, upper class, whatever. And even with the revolutions and fighting, any society will go back to this. So Winston stops reading, and he's just like happy to realize, ooh, I'm reading this book in a safe, comfortable place, right? Knowing that he's going to come back to this chapter, he jumps ahead to chapter 3, which is called War is Peace, another party slogan, and he starts reading again. So here are the basic ideas. It explains how the world is divided into 3 superpowers, Oceania, Eurasia, and Eastasia. These 3 states follow basically geography, but the borders are a little bit in fluctuation depending on what's happening between the three powers. The three superpowers have been in a constant war, but it's a controlled war, right? It's fought just on the fringes of the territory. It's still bloody, and they still do horrible things to enemies, but the deaths are limited in a confined area. So the impacts on the rest of the country are, shortages of necessary supplies and occasional bombings. But for the most part, the middle areas of the country are stable. The three powers are so evenly matched that no one has the advantage. Even if they team up, two can't beat the one. So the reason for war really going on is for manpower that's to be basically slaves in that disputed area. So the resultant purpose of war, which is never put out there, is to use up what each state produces so that the quality of life inside of the state never gets better, right? The book recognizes that life before this was better, had a positive outlook, that mankind was doing better, and that technology and science was continually progressing. But all of that stopped with an atomic war in the 1950s, and now the only progress scientifically or otherwise is tied to war and spying. Everything else is stagnated. So continued progress, if mankind had continued, people would have been more and more equal, and the playing field between the low, middle, and high would have kind of evened out. So this continual war destroys the products that society produces without allowing any surplus. That way nobody's life gets better. The high stays high, the low stays low, but the highs even are kept on the edge of not having enough so that they're motivated to keep what they have. And the outer party still has it a little bit better than the proles, so they want to hold on to what they have as well. War also keeps up the morale of the party. Hatred and fear of the enemy, while love and support of the government is what they're trying to achieve, right? The higher up in the party means the more passionate someone feels about defeating the enemy. So if there's any doubt or disbelief, like, what are we doing here? They're supposed to neutralize that in their brain by doublethink. And we've talked about doublethink before. The book then goes on to explain that science isn't even a word anymore, but what is thought of science is focused on two things, right? Like I said, to figure out what someone is thinking, which is controlling the individual, and to kill several hundred million of people without warning in order to defeat the enemy. All three superstates have the stockpile of nuclear bombs, but they don't use them, and they never get close enough to developing this ultimate weapon. So there's this stalemate of shifting alliances and surprise attacks and these battles over this little bit of disputed territory. This has resulted in all three states kind of being isolated and self-reliant, so no one knows each other except as the enemy, right? None of the average citizens know that life in all three states is basically the same, controlled by totalitarian regimes. Since it's a continuous war and it never there's no progress in the war, it's no longer dangerous. That's how come they say war is peace. So it's at the end of this chapter in the book that Julia shows up and makes coffee. She's not really interested in reading, so she tells him that he can read it to her. So after a little bit of time together, he goes back to chapter 1, Ignorance is Strength. And then what follows, believe it or not, is another 13 pages of political explanation. I told you this chapter is a little nuts. So here's the basic point of what you should pull out of these pages. Right? The chapter starts again with talking about the levels of society. The goal of the high is to stay the high. The middle wants to switch places with the high. And the low is so crushed by how hard life is, if they ever want anything, it's for everyone to be equal. So history, as we know it, right, has been where the middle is trying to enlist the low, the power of the low, to get rid of the high by saying we want to help everybody. But when the middle wins, the low is put back down and the middle becomes the high. Then a new middle comes out of either of those groups and the cycle repeats. The book, right, gives a couple examples of this historically. So when people develop like the machine age, right, when there's a real chance because people don't have to work as hard of being more equal, this is a threat to the preservation of power. So totalitarian governments became the standard to hold on to power. This all started then, according to Orwell's narration, in the 1930s. And from that political thought, the beliefs of the superstates began to emerge. And to solidify power, they used propaganda and manipulation and 24-hour surveillance to control the population to keep the power. So the book says that in the 1950s, when there was a whole regrouping of society again, this time the highs knew how to keep power. So they made no more private property and everything belonged to the group so that economic inequality would be permanent. The government controlled it. The structure of Oceania, right, was proles, outer party, and inner party. And at the top of the inner party is Big Brother. He's the figurehead, and he's designed to keep the highs in power. So it describes the inner party as the brain, the outer party as the hands, and the proles, like 85% of the population makes up the proles, right? They're like cattle, and the inner party is only like 2%, right? So some people can transition from inner party to outer party and vice versa. So if you're really ambitious in the outer party, you could become inner. If you're really weak in the inner party, you can become outer. But the proles stay proles. Now, if there's a prole that's potentially smart or a problem, they just kill it. So they are looked on as brainless, and they are kind of left to their own devices where they can breed, work, and die. Repeat the cycle. It's the party member, the brains, and the more intelligent that are controlled at all times. So there is no law, but every action is under scrutiny for a deviation or a struggle with being a part of the party. The goal is for every party member to live in a constant hate for the enemy and a constant love for the government. That's life. So it's in this section that there's quite a few newspeak words when it comes to what their importance in the party. And following these principles is called orthodoxy. And these words are covered in another video, terms, in 1984. But the terms good thinker, crime stop, black-white, and double think are all dealt with here. If you've read the book so far, most of these terms have been brought up. The result of using or employing in your mind those ideas is that you, as you understand these principles, you fool yourself more and more. And the more smart you are, actually the less sane you are, because you are making yourself believe the lies of the party and then forget that you made yourself believe the lies of the party. So at the end of the chapter, Winston gets to a part of this book that starts to ask the question as, well, why can't humanity be equal? Why is this something to be avoided? The book says that this is the central secret and that the real motive for this is, and actually this is where Winston stops because he notices how quiet it is and that Julia has fallen asleep. He realizes he actually has already understood the how. Everything that he has read, he kind of knows, but what he doesn't know is the why. Why is it this way? Why does it have to be this way? The book that he just read kind of helped organize what he already knew. He falls asleep himself at this point, feeling safe and that everything is okay. So that was a lot, right? It's a hard chapter to get through. So what's the takeaway from this chapter? Why is it important? Here's why. It's a way for Orwell to lay out patterns of historical political upheaval, to give them all labels. And remember, Orwell is writing during a time where brutal dictatorships and totalitarian regimes are slaughtering millions to grow and maintain power, right? This is World War II era. So there were real and brutal threats to freedom that were growing out of socialism and communism. So Orwell is painting a picture of a pathway these political ideologies could take if they were left unchecked in the world. Orwell sees the threat as very real because he looks around and that's what's happening in the world in front of his very eyes. It's pretty terrifying and it's really all too real. I believe these chapters exist in such kind of a dry and matter-of-fact way because they kind of like take us out of the story of the book, and they just kind of give this political theory that the story of the book is kind of written about. The book is depicting this political theory, a real world Orwell's living in, and really we're still living in today. There's some terrifying things happening in the world and some terrifying governments. When this was written in in the 50s, 84 was 30 plus years down the line, and even though we're now looking backwards in 1984, when we look at the world around us, we could call this book 2084, and it would be just as great of a warning as it was during George Orwell's time. So I hope that's helpful. It was a lot. If you stuck through the whole thing, thanks. Would love it if you could subscribe and like and share. That would be amazing. If you have any questions, let us know. We're happy to talk literature with you. Until then, we will see you next time. Take care.